November 8, 1942. Oran, Algeria. The first shots of Operation Torch echoed across the North African coast just before dawn, sharp cracks that shattered the stillness of the Mediterranean morning. German Oberstfreiter Klaus Hartmann crouched behind a stone wall on the outskirts of the city, his carabiner 98K bolt-action rifle pressed against his shoulder. The air tasted of cordite and dust, and the rising sun painted the white buildings of Oran in shades of amber and gold. Hartmann had fought in Poland, in France, in the opening months of the Russian campaign. He knew the sound of battle intimately, the methodical crack of rifle fire, the staccato bursts of machine guns, the thunder of artillery. But as the first American soldiers advanced through the olive groves below his position, he heard something different, something wrong. The rifles did not crack in measured intervals, the way a disciplined infantry unit should fire. They roared, a continuous, rolling thunder of semi-automatic fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if each American soldier carried the firepower of an entire squad. Hartmann worked his bolt, ejected the spent cartridge, loaded another round, aimed, fired, worked the bolt again. Below him, the Americans advanced without pausing, their rifles spitting bullets in a rhythm that never stopped. He fired again, worked the bolt, and in the fraction of a second it took to chamber the next round, he realized with cold certainty that he was already obsolete. The weapon that announced America's arrival in the European theater was not a tank or a bomber, but a rifle, the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic marvel that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger, without the need to manually cycle a bolt between shots. To the German Wehrmacht, which had built the most formidable military machine in Europe using bolt-action rifles descended from designs created in the 1890s, the M1 Garand was an object of derision. German military theorists had examined semi-automatic rifle designs and rejected them as wasteful, impractical, and symptomatic of American industrial excess. A properly trained infantryman, they argued, needed only 5 rounds to accomplish his mission. Accuracy and discipline mattered more than volume of fire. The Carabiner 98K, with its 5-round internal magazine and manual bolt operation, was a weapon for professionals, for soldiers who made every shot count. The Garand, with its 8-round capacity and semi-automatic action, was a weapon for amateurs, for soldiers who relied on firepower to compensate for lack of skill. This assessment was repeated in German tactical manuals, in officer training schools, in the confident conversations of soldiers who had conquered most of Europe in 2 years. The Americans, they said, did not know how to fight. They only knew how to spend money. And when they finally arrived in Europe, with their excessive rifles and their industrial naivete, they would be taught the realities of modern warfare by soldiers who had perfected it. This belief persisted until the first firefights in North Africa. And then, with brutal suddenness, it died. The M1 Garand was born not from military brilliance, but from bureaucratic frustration and one man's stubborn genius. John Candius Garand was a Canadian-born machinist who had moved to the United States in 1898, part of the great wave of immigrants who fled rural poverty for the promise of American industry. He found work in textile mills, then in machine shops, and eventually at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, where the U.S. Army designed and manufactured its weapons. Garand was a quiet, meticulous man who spoke with a thick French-Canadian accent and spent his evenings sketching mechanical designs in notebooks he kept stacked beside his bed. In 1919, the U.S. Army issued a challenge: design a semi-automatic rifle that could replace the Springfield bolt-action rifle used in World War I. The requirements were daunting. The weapon had to be reliable in mud, sand, and snow. It had to be accurate at 500 yards. It had to be simple enough for a conscript to maintain. And it had to be manufacturable on a mass scale. Dozens of designers submitted prototypes. Most failed within weeks. Garand's design took 17 years to perfect. The technical innovations of the M1 Garand were subtle but revolutionary. Unlike bolt-action rifles, which required the soldier to manually eject each spent cartridge and chamber a new round, the Garand used the expanding gases from each shot to cycle the action automatically. A gas piston beneath the barrel drove a bolt carrier rearward, ejecting the empty casing and loading a fresh round from an 8-round in-block clip. The entire process took a fraction of a second, allowing a soldier to fire as rapidly as he could squeeze the trigger. The weapon weighed 9.5 pounds, slightly heavier than the German Kar 98K, but its balance was exquisite. The weight distributed so that even prolonged firing did not fatigue the shooter. The sights were simple and intuitive. The trigger broke cleanly, and the sound it made when the last round was fired, a distinctive metallic ping as the empty clip ejected, became one of the most recognizable sounds of the Second World War. By 1936, the U.S. Army adopted the M1 Garand as its standard service rifle, the first military in the world to issue a semi-automatic rifle to every infantryman. Production began slowly, then accelerated. By 1941, when America entered the war, Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms were manufacturing thousands of Garands every week. By 1945, more than 5.5 million had been produced. German intelligence officers, reviewing reports of the M1 Garand in the late 1930s, were unimpressed. The weapon, they concluded, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of infantry tactics. The German doctrine, refined through the Spanish Civil War and the campaigns in Poland and France, emphasized Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics that gave small unit leaders autonomy to achieve objectives using combined arms. Infantry squads were built around the machine gun, not the rifle. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 machine gun provided suppressive fire, while riflemen maneuvered and closed with the enemy. The rifleman's job was not to spray bullets, but to deliver precise shots at critical moments. In this doctrinal framework, a semi-automatic rifle was not an advantage. It was a liability. It encouraged soldiers to waste ammunition. It increased logistical burdens. It sacrificed accuracy for volume. And it reflected, in the eyes of German officers, a peculiarly American obsession with technology as a substitute for training. This assessment was codified in a 1941 Wehrmacht intelligence report captured after the war, which stated, "The American semi-automatic rifle is a weapon suited to a nation with more factories than discipline. It will not compensate for inferior tactics or lack of fighting spirit." The report concluded that American infantry, equipped with the Garand, would pose no significant threat to German forces in a direct engagement. This conclusion would be tested within a year, and it would be found catastrophically wrong. The first major encounter between American infantry armed with Garands and German forces occurred in Tunisia in early 1943, during the Battle of Kasserine Pass. The Americans, newly arrived and poorly coordinated, were mauled by German armor and veteran infantry. It was a humiliating defeat, one that seemed to confirm German assumptions about American military competence. But in the firefights that occurred on the edges of that battle, something unexpected emerged. German soldiers reported that American infantry, even when retreating, maintained a volume of fire that made pursuit dangerous. Squad-level engagements that should have been quick victories turned into grinding exchanges where the Americans, despite their inexperience, could hold positions simply by saturating them with bullets. A captured German lieutenant, interrogated by American intelligence officers in March 1943, described the experience. "We could hear them reloading. With our rifles, we must work the bolt, take aim, fire again. In that time, the American has fired 3, 4, 5 shots. It is like fighting a machine gun, but every man carries one." This was not the report of a defeated soldier making excuses. It was an observation, clinical and unsettling, from a professional who had fought across Europe and was now confronting something his training had not prepared him for. The symbolic object that came to define the clash between German doctrine and American firepower was not the rifle itself, but the sound it made, the metallic ping of the ejecting in-block clip. German soldiers learned to listen for that sound, because it signaled the moment when an American rifleman's Garand was empty and he was vulnerable. In theory, this was an exploitable weakness. In practice, it rarely mattered. By the time a German soldier heard the ping, identified its source, and prepared to advance, the American had already reloaded. a process that took less than 3 seconds for a trained soldier. And even if one American was reloading, 3 or 4 others were still firing, their Garands maintaining a continuous wall of lead that made movement suicidal. The ping became a psychological weapon, a sound that promised vulnerability but delivered only more fire. German soldiers began to dread it, not because it meant an American was empty, but because it meant he would be full again in seconds, and the roar would continue. One German corporal, in a letter to his brother captured by Allied censors, wrote, "The Americans do not aim. They simply point and fire, until everything is dead or running. It is not soldiering. It is butchery by machine." The letter was dated July 1944, written from Normandy. By then, the butchery had become routine. The Battle of Normandy, beginning with the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, was where the M1 Garand proved its decisive advantage. In the hedgerows of bocage country, where visibility was measured in yards and ambushes occurred at point-blank range, the ability to fire rapidly without working a bolt meant the difference between life and death. German defenders, equipped with Kar 98K rifles and positioned in prepared defenses, should have had every advantage. They knew the terrain. They had established fields of fire. They had experience and discipline. But the Americans had Garands. In the brutal, intimate firefights that characterized the Normandy breakout, American infantry squads could deliver twice the volume of fire as their German counterparts. When a German soldier rose to throw a grenade, an American could fire 3 rounds before he completed the motion. When a German squad attempted to maneuver, American riflemen could saturate their position with fire while machine gunners repositioned. The mathematical advantage was simple but overwhelming. In any engagement involving riflemen, the side with semi-automatic weapons could fire more bullets in less time, suppressing the enemy and enabling their own maneuver. The Germans, who had designed their infantry doctrine around the superiority of their machine guns and the precision of their riflemen, found themselves outgunned at the squad level by an enemy they had dismissed as industrially profligate. The superiority of the Garand was quantified in after-action reports and studies conducted by U.S. Army ordnance officers throughout the war. In a typical infantry engagement at ranges between 100 to 300 yards, the distance at which most firefights occurred, a soldier armed with a Kar 98K could fire approximately 15 well-aimed shots per minute, accounting for the time required to work the bolt, re-aim, and fire again. A soldier armed with an M1 Garand could fire between 40 and 50 shots per minute, limited only by how fast he could change clips and pull the trigger. This 3-to-1 advantage in rate of fire translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. A U.S. Army study conducted in 1944, analyzing engagements in Italy, found that American rifle squads achieved fire superiority in 82% of engagements, even when outnumbered or in inferior positions. The reason, the study concluded, was the sustained volume of semi-automatic rifle fire, which allows U.S. infantry to suppress enemy positions while maneuvering, a capability enemy forces armed with bolt-action rifles cannot match. The report was classified during the war, but its conclusions were visible on every battlefield where American and German infantry met. German attempts to respond to the Garand's advantage came too late and were never adequate. In 1943, the Wehrmacht began issuing the Gewehr 43, a semi-automatic rifle designed to counter the American M1. But the G43 was produced in limited numbers, fewer than 500,000 by war's end, compared to over 5 million Garands. It was also less reliable, prone to jamming in the mud and cold that characterized the Eastern and Western fronts. Most German soldiers never received a semi-automatic rifle. They fought the entire war with the same bolt-action Kar 98K their grandfathers had carried, working the bolt with numb fingers, firing and chambering, while across from them American soldiers squeezed triggers and watched their enemies fall in a rhythm that never paused. The disparity was not lost on German commanders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, writing in his diary after observing American infantry in Normandy, noted, "The enemy's semi-automatic rifle gives him a significant advantage in small unit engagements. Our doctrine, which relies on machine guns for firepower and rifles for precision, is sound in theory, but fails when every enemy rifleman possesses the firepower of a light machine gun. Rommel recommended an urgent increase in production of semi-automatic rifles and submachine guns to close the firepower gap. His recommendation was forwarded to Berlin. By the time any meaningful production increase could occur, Germany was losing the war on all fronts, and the weapons that might have made a difference were never manufactured in sufficient numbers. The psychological impact of facing American infantry armed with Garands extended beyond the purely tactical. German soldiers, who had been taught that they were the elite of Europe, that their training and discipline were unmatched, found themselves systematically outfought by enemy infantry who, in terms of training time and military tradition, were inferior on paper. The Americans were conscripts, most of them farmers or factory workers 6 months earlier, who had received basic training and been shipped overseas with minimal combat experience. The Germans were veterans, many with years of frontline service, who had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and nearly destroyed the Soviet Union in a single summer. By every metric of military professionalism, the Germans should have been superior. But professionalism, it turned out, was less important than firepower. And firepower was something the Americans had in abundance. This realization, that individual skill and experience mattered less than the tools a soldier carried, was demoralizing in a way that battlefield defeats were not. It suggested that the entire edifice of German military superiority, built on notions of racial and cultural supremacy, was false. That wars were not won by better men, but by better factories, and that the United States, with its assembly lines and its immigrant workers and its mass-produced rifles, had built a military machine that could grind down any enemy through sheer material weight. The testimony of German prisoners of war, collected by Allied intelligence officers throughout 1944 and 1945, reveals the depth of this demoralization. A German sergeant captured near Aachen in October 1944 told his interrogators, "We were told the Americans could not fight, that they were soft, that they would break when facing real soldiers. But they do not break. They come forward, and their rifles never stop firing, and when you think you have a moment to move, to breathe, the firing begins again. It is not courage. It is not skill. It is simply endless bullets." Another prisoner, a corporal from a parachute regiment, stated, "In Russia, we fought men who were brave and stupid, who threw themselves at us in waves and died by the thousands. In France, we fought men who were clever and proud, who fought well, but could be outmaneuvered. The Americans are neither brave nor clever. They are relentless. They do not charge. They advance, and they shoot, and they do not stop shooting until everything is dead." These were not the words of men who had been beaten by superior tactics. They were the words of men who had been beaten by superior tools, and who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the outcome of the war had never been in doubt. Not because the Allies were better soldiers, but because they could arm every soldier with a weapon that multiplied his effectiveness by 3. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army swept across France and into Germany with a speed that astonished even Allied planners, understood the Garand's role in American success. In a speech to ordnance officers in 1945, Patton called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. It was not hyperbole. Patton had fought in World War I with bolt-action rifles and knew intimately the limitations they imposed on infantry tactics. The Garand, he argued, had fundamentally changed what infantry could accomplish. It allowed American soldiers to fight aggressively, to advance under fire, to suppress enemy positions without waiting for machine gun support. It transformed every rifleman into a light machine gunner, every squad into a fire team capable of independent action. And it did so without requiring years of training or exceptional skill. A farm boy from Iowa, with 12 weeks of basic training and a Garand, could hold his own against a German veteran with 3 years of combat experience and a Kar 98K. The rifle did not make American soldiers better. It made them more effective. And in modern war, effectiveness was all that mattered. The M1 Garand's impact extended beyond the European theater. In the Pacific, where American Marines and soldiers fought across islands against Japanese defenders armed with bolt-action Arisaka rifles, the Garand provided a similar advantage. Japanese infantry tactics, which emphasized aggressive close-quarters combat and night infiltration, were devastated by the volume of fire American riflemen could produce. A Japanese soldier attempting a banzai charge, a tactic that had terrified Chinese and British troops, ran into a wall of semi-automatic fire that cut down attackers before they could close to bayonet range. In the dense jungles of Guadalcanal, the mountains of Okinawa, and the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, the Garand gave American infantry the firepower to hold positions against numerically superior forces and the confidence to advance into terrain where ambush was expected. Japanese prisoners, interrogated after their capture, expressed bewilderment at the Americans' rate of fire. One captured officer, speaking to interrogators on Saipan in 1944, said, "We expected them to fire slowly, to conserve ammunition as we do, but they fire without pause. It is as if each man carries a machine gun. How can we close with an enemy who fires like this?" The answer, of course, was that they could not. And so, island after island, the Japanese died in their trenches and bunkers, overwhelmed not by superior courage or skill, but by a rifle that could fire faster than they could react. The logistical implications of the Garand were as important as its tactical advantages. The U.S. military, with its unmatched industrial base and global supply network, could afford to equip every infantryman with a semi-automatic rifle and keep him supplied with ammunition. The Germans, struggling to fuel tanks and feed armies on two fronts, could not. By 1944, German soldiers were often rationed to fewer than 60 rounds per day, a constraint that made sustained firefights impossible. American soldiers, by contrast, carried 80 rounds as a basic load and could request resupply at will. Ammunition was never a limiting factor for U.S. forces. This disparity reinforced the Garand's effectiveness. A weapon that could fire rapidly was only useful if the soldier had bullets to fire. The Americans had both. The Germans had neither. And so, in engagement after engagement, American infantry could simply outshoot their opponents, firing until German positions were suppressed, then advancing while the enemy reloaded or took cover. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of warfare German officers had studied in military academies. But it worked. And in the grinding arithmetic of industrial war, what worked was what mattered. The rifle that German theorists had dismissed as a symbol of American excess became, in the hands of American infantrymen, the instrument of German defeat. Not the only instrument. American artillery, air power, and logistics were equally important, but the most personal one. The Garand was the weapon that individual soldiers carried into combat, the tool they relied on when artillery was silent and air support was absent. It was the weapon they cleaned at night in foxholes, that they cradled when they slept, that they fired until the barrel grew hot and their ears rang with the concussion. And it was the weapon that, more than any other, defined the experience of American infantry in World War II. Veterans of the war, interviewed decades later, spoke of the Garand with a reverence usually reserved for family heirlooms. They remembered its weight, its balance, the way the bolt snapped forward when loading a fresh clip. They remembered the confidence it gave them, the knowledge that they could fire 8 rounds as fast as thought without pausing to work a bolt. And they remembered the ping, that distinctive sound of the clip ejecting, which meant it was time to reload and keep fighting. For many veterans, the Garand was not just a weapon. It was the reason they survived. Klaus Hartmann, the German soldier who had crouched behind a stone wall in Oran and heard the Garand's roar for the first time, survived the North African campaign. He fought in Sicily, then Italy, then was transferred to the Western Front in time for the Normandy invasion. He was wounded twice, recovered, and fought again. In April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east, Hartmann's unit was defending a village west of the Elbe River. American forces, advancing from the opposite direction, reached the village first. Hartmann, exhausted and out of ammunition, surrendered. In the prisoner of war camp where he was held, He was interviewed by an American intelligence officer interested in German perceptions of American weapons. Hartmann, who had spent 3 years fighting against the Garand, offered a simple assessment. Your rifle won the war. Not your tanks, not your planes. Your rifle. Because every man who carried it was as dangerous as 5 of ours. We could not train fast enough, fight hard enough, or die bravely enough to overcome that. The intelligence officer noted the comment in his report, but did not forward it to higher command. By then, the war in Europe was over, and such observations were merely historical footnotes. But Hartmann's words captured a truth that German military planners had refused to accept until it was too late. That in modern industrial warfare, the side that equipped its soldiers with superior tools would prevail, regardless of tradition, training, or ideology. The M1 Garand remained the standard U.S. service rifle until 1957, when it was replaced by the M14, itself a modified Garand design. More than 6 million Garands were manufactured during and after World War II. Many were given to Allied nations or sold as surplus. Some are still in use today, in ceremonial roles or as competition rifles. The sound of a Garand firing and the distinctive ping of its ejecting clip can still be heard at shooting ranges across America, a mechanical echo of the weapon that armed the generation that defeated fascism. John Garand, the immigrant machinist who designed the rifle, received no royalties for his invention. The patents belonged to the U.S. government. He retired from Springfield Armory in 1953 with a modest pension and died in 1974, largely forgotten outside the community of firearms enthusiasts and military historians. He never sought fame. He had only wanted to build something that worked, something that would help the country that had given him a chance. In this, he succeeded beyond any measure. The rifle that bore his name armed the soldiers who liberated Europe, who island-hopped across the Pacific, who stood against tyranny at a moment when the outcome was uncertain. It was not the most accurate rifle ever made. It was not the lightest or the most elegant. But it was reliable, effective, and utterly democratic, a weapon that worked equally well in the hands of a Texas rancher or a Brooklyn dockworker, that required no aristocratic training or warrior tradition, only the willingness to point it and pull the trigger. The German soldiers who laughed at the M1 Garand, who dismissed it as American extravagance and industrial naivete, learned a lesson that would echo through the remainder of the 20th century. That wars are not won by the nation with the oldest traditions or the most disciplined soldiers, but by the nation that can produce the best tools and place them in the hands of ordinary people. The Garand was such a tool. It did not make American soldiers braver. It made them more effective. And in the calculus of modern war, effectiveness is the only currency that matters. The Germans fought with honor, with discipline, with weapons that had been perfected over decades of refinement. But they fought with bolt-action rifles, and the Americans fought with semi-automatic fire. And in the end, the difference was measured not in courage or skill, but in bodies. The Germans could not reload fast enough, could not fire fast enough, could not compensate through training or tradition for the simple mechanical advantage the Garand provided. And so they lost, not because they were inferior soldiers, but because they carried inferior rifles. This was the lesson of the M1 Garand. It was a lesson written in the mud of Normandy, in the snow of the Ardennes, in the rubble of German cities. And it was a lesson that the Wehrmacht, for all its brilliance and ferocity, learned too late to matter. There is a cemetery in Luxembourg where more than 5,000 American soldiers are buried, their graves marked with white crosses that stretch in perfect rows across the green hillside. Among them are men who carried the M1 Garand into battle, who fired it until their shoulders ached and their fingers bled, who cleaned it in the rain and slept with it in the cold. They came from farms and cities, from families that had been in America for generations and families that had arrived only years before. They were not professional soldiers. They were citizens armed by their nation and sent across an ocean to fight an enemy most of them had never seen. And they won, not because they were exceptional, but because their country had given them tools that made them exceptional. The Garand was one such tool. It was a piece of machinery, cold metal, and precisely machined parts, devoid of sentiment or ideology. But in the hands of those young men, It became something more, a symbol of industrial democracy, of a nation that could equip every soldier with the best rifle in the world and send him forward with the confidence that he was not fighting alone, that behind him stood factories and engineers and a whole society committed to his success. The Germans fought for an ideology that valued hierarchy and sacrifice. The Americans fought with a rifle that valued effectiveness and equality. And in the end, the rifle and the system that produced it prevailed. That is the truth the M1 Garand represents. Not that machines are better than men, but that a society which gives its men the best machines will triumph over one that demands they compensate with blood. It is a cold truth, an industrial truth, but it is the truth nonetheless. And it was proven 8 rounds at a time across every battlefield where the Garand's distinctive roar announced that American infantry had arrived, and the outcome was no longer in doubt.